Okay, let's get started. So welcome everybody to this latest MHHS webinar. This one is on the Readiness Assessment 2, and this is for us to go through the overall report. Next slide. So obviously I'll do a brief introduction, then obviously the meat of the Readiness Assessment will be Pete, my colleague Pete will take you through, and then we'll do the Q&As, which Alice will be very kindly facilitating for us. So as always, if you want to put question to us, then can you use Slido? The usual place, slido.com, and MHHS is the code to get into our own area. So, next slide, please. So, just to briefly remind you, why are we holding this webinar? What we want to do is obviously take you through the overall report from the Readiness Assessment 2 that many of you took the trouble to fill in for us. The point is to highlight to you the key report findings and noting the statistics that we use to inform the conditional approval of Milestone 3, which is the start of design, build and test. It also creates an opportunity for you to ask questions about the results of the overall readiness assessment. Obviously, we've also dispatched to you, along with the full overall report, your own individual reports. Obviously, we can't discuss them in the company, but you can obviously take those up with your PPC reps as and when you have meetings with them, or you can request meetings with them if you have some particular concern about them. The question has been asked as to why we perform readiness assessment. It's a key element of our understanding to understand the status of all the programme participants, and it allows us to make informed decision making as we approach key programme milestones. So it's very important to us that we get these readiness assessments back, because otherwise we can't make. The more we get back, the more informed our decisions will be made, and obviously the decision we make impact you as programme participants. It also allows us to identify common risk and pain points, and then obviously we can look at addressing and mitigating some of those if action is required. It also has the advantage of allowing you to assess your own progress compared to that of your peer group. So the overall report allows you to give you something to compare your own report against and recognise where you are in the pecking order. It also creates an opportunity to seek support from us if you need some extra help in a bit more focus on a particular area. As I said before, it also gives you an opportunity to ask questions. So when we were going through the questions that come up on Slido at the end of this webinar. So if you do have any questions as they come along, then by all means ping them into Slido and Alice will go through them at the end. So without further ado, it's enough for me. I'll hand you over to Pete, who's going to take you through the report itself. All yours, Pete.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Chris. So for those that haven't met before, my name is Pete and I'm the Readiness Assessment Lead on the programme. And as Chris alluded to there, we just want to say thanks a lot for taking the time to respond to the second Readiness Assessment. We know there were quite a lot of questions to get through. And so in this report, we've been essentially crunching all of the data from that particular survey and turning them into actionable insights, which the SRO can then use to make decisions on the programme, most notably in relation to Milestone 3. So in terms of what I'm going to cover here, obviously I'm not going to cover all 57 slides of the overall report, even though that has been sent around to all of the principal contacts in your organisation for review. What I'm going to focus on here are the elements you see in red. So mainly that's looking at the executive summary from the report, the response rate we got, the M3 decision and overall readiness. So M3, of course, as a reminder, was looking at whether or not participants were ready to begin design, build and test on the 1st of November. And then we also thought we'd look at one of the 5 criteria in relation to Milestone 3. So that criteria number 1 there, programme plans. We think that's going to be a really key element going into the replan round 3 consultation in January. So we really wanted to call that out as well. And then onto the bottom half of the slide there, you'll see a couple of other items. The common themes of the deep dive interviews. So again, thanks so much to anyone who went through a deep dive interview. They're really, really useful from our perspective. And then also a very brief bit on testing at the end, particularly in relation to SIT. So in terms of the purpose of this report, I think primarily, at least at first, a lot of the slides in here were aimed at the SRO. So the SRO needed to make a decision on Milestone 3, readiness to start DBT at the November PSG. And so these slides, I think, gave some quantitative data to the SRO to say, you know, X number of participants think that they're going to be ready to start DBT. And then we also had the data analysis of the evidence that was submitted to support those self-assessments of readiness as well. But this report, the one that's been now publicised to all of the industry, is also about being totally transparent about what came out of the readiness assessment, where we think the industry is as a whole in relation to various different questions, particularly in relation to the starting of DBT. And just to flick to the bottom left of that, so what methodology was used in RA2? I mean, it feels like a long time ago now. Over 10 weeks ago, on the 16th of September, we sent out the first survey. Participants were given 3 weeks to respond to that. And then we held deep dive interviews from the 7th of October through to the 21st of October. So between that date and now, it's myself and the PPC team have really been reviewing all of the evidence that you kindly submitted and turning that into these reports and the individual reports that your organisation will have received as well if you submitted a response to the readiness assessment. And then to come to the right-hand side here, just looking at what RA2 was really concerned with, I think the top one almost is self-explanatory, the overall readiness. That was the key question that Milestone 3 was going to be looking at. But then the 5 items you see beneath it there, going from program plans through to the impact assessments and software providers, those were considered the 5 criteria for an organisation to be deemed ready to start DBT. And essentially, in order for an organisation to be considered ready, they had to meet all 5 of those criteria. But we'll come on to that in a bit more detail shortly. So this is the executive summary. So apologies for the slightly busy slide, but it's trying to condense 57 slides into one. So I think the key messages here are that there are 2 really good news stories and 1 less good news story. So your 2 good news stories are in the blue and the turquoise boxes there. So response rate we were really encouraged by. So in readiness assessment 1, we got 46% of participants sending in a response. That was increased up to 53. And if you look at it in terms of market share, we were way above that number as well. So in terms of the supplier market measured by MPANs, we were up at 98%. DNOs, we got 100%, central parties 100%, and agents 81%. So they were all of the constituencies where we were able to get market share data, and it really showed that essentially the larger organisations were sending in their responses to RA2 to a greater extent than the smaller organisations. Now, in terms of the escalation process for non-responders, we're still in discussions with the IPA about exactly what we're going to be doing there, but we think it will probably be a 2-track process. One route of escalation for those organisations who didn't respond to requests for a deep dive interview. There were 3 of those. And then we also may have a separate escalation process for organisations that didn't respond to the readiness assessment survey. But as I said, we're awaiting a few more details on that. I'd say the second good news story was around the central turquoise box there, so around the self-assessment of DBT readiness. So in terms of the self-assessment, the results indicated that we had 100% of the DNO market and 68% of the supplier market believing that they were ready to start DBT on the 1st of November. And that supplier share of the market we're expecting to increase to 80% by the end of 2022. So as I say, that's a self-assessment. That's not based upon any PPC reviews of the evidence that participants submitted to support those claims, but that was the self-assessment. I'd say the less good news came when the PPC did come to review their evidence itself. So that red box there in the top right, we found that most participants, when judged by the evidence they'd submitted, normally met 1, maybe 2 of the 5 criteria for DBT readiness. And therefore, ultimately, that lay behind the SRO's decision to only conditionally approve Milestone 3 at the November PSG. But we'll, as I say, come to that in a bit more detail shortly. So to look at the bottom half of this slide then, so the key themes of the deep dives, I'll go into these in a bit more detail later on, but I think the key ones were the fears of regret spend prior to Milestone 5. So essentially a lot of organisations wanted a baseline design to work from before they began their own DBT. I think a lot of those issues will have dissolved now that Milestone 5 has passed. Competing priorities, I think that was an expected one given the market conditions that the industry is currently facing, the government's price guarantee schemes, and to an extent faster switching, again proving to be competing priorities with MHHS. And finally, in terms of a deep dive theme, I'd say this one was actually a nice surprise. So I think from conversations with participants, it emerged that a lot of organisations were actually going to be ready to start technical design on the 1st of November this year, whereas in the Replan round 2 consultation we'd put out, we'd actually not envisaged technical design starting until Q1 of next year, and we were looking at more activities, more like planning and procurement and impact assessment to take place as of 1st of November. So that was a nice surprise, that one. In terms of other positives in RA2, the central column there, as I mentioned, I think the self-assessment was very positive. A number of organisations expecting themselves to be ready to start DBT on the 1st of November. And we also had a very strong appetite for SIT. So 52% of participants said that they would, at least in theory or hypothetically, be keen to take part in SIT, even though there were requests for more information around the approach and the scope and benefits and things like that. And finally, the comms engagement went down very well. So I think there were a lot of favourable comparisons made between the comms to date on MHHS and perhaps some of the comms mechanisms like the collaboration-based equivalent used on faster switching. And the overall score was 4.6 out of 6 for comms engagement, which was very strong. And finally, to the slightly more negative elements on the right, the key risks that we've pulled out. So we were slightly disappointed by software provider engagement. That was down at 34%. And whilst we acknowledged there wasn't actually an obligation on software providers to respond, we were hoping that number might be slightly higher. And similarly for small and INC providers potentially not being ready to start DBT, the self-assessment of readiness there only came in at around 22-23% of the market for each of those. So again, that might be an area of attention for the MHHS in the future. And last point on this slide is the evidence, as mentioned, for M3 wasn't quite where we wanted it to be. So that meant that the Milestone 3 could only be conditionally approved. But I will come to that in, I believe, the next slide. Yes, there we go. So this is a very quick summary of the PSG decision made in November. So hopefully you'll be aware of this already, but just a very quick recap. Milestone 3 was conditionally approved because the feeling was that the evidence wasn't there to pass the milestone unconditionally. And that meant that we're going to have a further look at Milestone 3 at the end of January, start of February next year. What's that going to involve? Well, we think there's going to be more evidence required for unconditional approval. I think you'll be pleased to know that the criteria or the conditions for passing that milestone are going to be simplified. So they won't be exactly the same as we've had in Readiness Assessment 3, Readiness Assessment 2, and they're going to be agreed with the IPA over the next few weeks to make sure that they're happy with the new criteria we agree. And finally, in the red box there, the timelines we're going to be putting in place for that. Essentially, we're making sure that Replan round 3 takes place after the decision has been made in mid-December on migration, and then the window for submitting delivery timelines and any other documentation that's requested as a result of the new Replan round 3 criteria is going to be requested by the end of January or potentially mid-January if an organisation wants to be an early adopter and part of SIT. And just looking at the final couple of actions down bottom there, I'm just going to call out that the second bullet point, revising the M3 criteria. As I mentioned, I think that's a really key activity for the programme because that's simplifying a lot of the criteria that was used in RA2 to make sure that it's easier to understand for participants in the Replan round 3. So to come on to one of the good news stories of RA2, so I think this was on response rate. So as you can see in that table there, the first 4 constituencies all had 100% response rate. That's central parties, DNOs, large suppliers and medium suppliers. And then I think if we take a few other examples like independent agents, even though that was down at 35%, in terms of market share, that was much higher, up in the 80s. I think that was a lot of much smaller independent meter operators that weren't responding to that. So we're not too concerned there. I think the areas we perhaps hoped for a bit more uptake was, as I mentioned, software providers, 34%. That could have been a bit higher. And small suppliers, 37%. We know that we need to have a bit more work to do to make sure that engagement is improved for that constituency. So if we go to the next slide, which has market share data, this was where we were much more encouraged by it in terms of the response rate. So as you can see, 100% of DNOs there. And in terms of the supplier market, we had 98.5% response. So in terms of getting the large and medium suppliers on board, that was absolutely fine. And on the right-hand side there, as I mentioned previously, agents responded with 81% on average in terms of market share. So although the raw numbers indicate only 35% responded, the market share was actually more like up in the 80s. This is just a very quick recap of the criteria we set out for DBT readiness in CR9. So it's casting your mind back quite a while now, but I think it was back in August, early September, we issued CR9 with these. This is the exact text from the CR, essentially outlining the conditions we were asking participants to meet in order to be considered ready to start DBT on the 1st of November. And I won't go through them in laborious detail, but the really key one was the program plan or delivery timeline, whatever you want to call it. The business case, making sure that the funding was in place for the next period of delivery, the 6 points of contact, and this will be something that the PPC continue to chase over the next few months, make sure that the board sponsors, delivery leads, design leads, test leads, PMO leads, and regs leads are all in place for each organisation that we consider to be big enough to have each of those roles in existence. And then finally, we've got the understanding of the TOM, the design, and the plan, and the readiness to start activities required to reach detailed design. So the key examples we looked at there were the impact assessment and the procurement plan as well. So the reason I've included this slide here, it's not telling you the results, but it's telling you the criteria that we measured against when putting RE2 into action. And so this was a really key slide. So this was, I would say, encouraging overall. It was the self-assessment of overall readiness from participants. And the graph you can see on the left-hand side there is measured as a total of the population of all participants, not just those that responded to readiness assessment 2. So you can see there the strongest uptake was amongst DNOs. All DNOs said that they were going to be ready to start DBT on the 1st of November on time. And then we had relatively high numbers across central parties, large suppliers, and medium suppliers as well. And as previously indicated, the numbers were slightly lower around I&C suppliers and smaller suppliers, but we know we've got a bit of work to do for those constituencies. And the story, I'd say, was even more positive in terms of market share. So again, 100% of DNOs think they're going to be ready to start DBT on time. And 68% of the supplier market, we expect that to rise to over 80% by the end of the year. So that's, again, an encouraging statistic in terms of DBT taking place on time. And in terms of the reasons we were given for non-readiness, so this was an interesting question, actually. So we found, almost unsurprisingly, that market conditions were top in terms of the reasons why participants thought they might not be ready to start DBT on time. But under that equally top one, other, I'd say that was primarily organisations that were putting off the start of design, build and test until they had a baseline design from the programme. Obviously, with the RE2 survey completing on the 7th of October, and then the design being signed off by the end of that month, I'm expecting a lot of those 21 other reasons for non-readiness to have dissolved now. And similarly, if you look at the fourth one down, 17 organisations saying they require more information from MHHS programme. All of the comments in those related to the design. So again, now the design has been baseline, we're expecting a lot of those issues to melt away. And this slide here was really important for the SRO in terms of making a decision to only conditionally approve Milestone 3. So this was the PPC's assessment of overall readiness. So this was based upon the evidence that participants uploaded to support their self-assessment. So the PPC went through and looked at various different program plans, design impact assessments and other documentation to assess whether or not the criteria had been met. And as you can see on the left-hand side there, the vast majority of organisations either fully or partially met one or two of the 5 criteria that we've been outlining. And it wasn't many organisations that actually fully met the criteria. In fact, it was only 2 organisations that fully met all 5 criteria. And then we had a handful more meeting 3 or 4 criteria. But as you can probably see, this is why the SRO didn't feel that we could unconditionally approve Milestone 3, because there was still a fair bit of evidence that needed to be collected to get this data. And on the right-hand side, telling a very similar story, measuring things by market share for once didn't actually improve the story we were telling. It was a very similar picture of only 1 or 2 criteria having been met. And so in terms of these specific criteria, the only one I'm going to talk about is the program plans. And the reason for that is that the expectation at the moment is that in order to unconditionally pass Milestone 3 in January, we're hoping that delivery timelines, program plans, whichever you want to call it, are going to be a really key feature of that. So as part of that replan consultation, organisations will be asked to provide their latest program plan, delivery timeline, so that the program can be essentially be given some reassurance that those plans are in place and that we can unconditionally approve milestone 3. So at Readiness Assessment 2, we found that 47 of our 94 participants self-assessed as having a program plan, but 48% of participants not only didn't have a plan in place at the moment, but didn't know when they were going to have one. So that was one of the factors in not unconditionally passing milestone 3. And on the next slide, we have more data in terms of self-assessment. So that number of 47 participants saying they've got a program plan in place, well, 9 of those didn't submit a plan and 4 of them didn't meet any of the criteria we set out for a program plan. So actually we found that only 34 plans actually fully or partially met the criteria that we'd outlined. So again, this is all a factor in why milestone 3 wasn't unconditionally approved. So to me, I'm moving away from the survey now to a certain extent. So we also held deep dives with 17 different organisations. The plan was to hold deep dive interviews with 20, but unfortunately 3 didn't respond. So we've outlined 10 themes across this in the next slide that really popped out from those deep dive interviews. So first up, as I've already mentioned, there are some participants that are actually ahead of schedule in terms of the replan round 2 that we've outlined. So that plan has technical design beginning in Q1 2023, whereas a lot of organisations had interpreted the start of DBT on 1st of November as being the start of their technical design. So those organisations are obviously ahead of the plan as it currently stands. The scope of change for some central parties was yet to be defined. I think this one was slightly more of an issue back when the deep dives were taking place than it is now. I think there's been some work done on this, but essentially the scope of responsibilities and the scope of the design under MHHS needed some hammering out with central parties in some cases. Engagement with software providers, I've already touched on. I think it's the PPC is going to take an action to start a bit more of an outreach campaign there and make sure that the software providers have everything that they need in order to get cracking with MHHS. And finally, the last 2 there, again, I think I mentioned these in the executive summary, but resource constraints, as expected, due to market conditions and the government's price guarantee schemes are proving a little bit of an issue. And similarly, there was a certain amount of reluctance to commit resources to DBT until the programme has signed off its design at M5. But as I said, that's now complete. And moving on to the next slide then, so awareness of working groups was raised by a few participants. I think there was perhaps a sense that decisions were being taken that they weren't 100% aware of or understood how that they could have input to those decisions. So the PPCs made sure that all of those organisations have been made aware of the different governance forums and structures on the MHHS programme. More of a flag for future actions than anything specific now on the next one, but we think that SIT, migration and the DIP procurement will be big factors, and that really came across in the deep dive interviews we held, that those were the issues that people really craved a bit more information on. And finally, so I'll say on this one, small suppliers, lack of engagement requiring escalation. As I say, the 3 smaller organisations that didn't respond to the request for a deep dive, those are going to be escalated in some form over the coming months. And similarly, we're in talks with the IPA about what to do with the organisations that didn't respond to the survey as well, but the decisions are pending there. We thought that perhaps the business case question could have been phrased slightly better from our own perspective. So it's really a learning for the PPC here, is that I think a lot of participants interpreted the question about business cases to be quite rigid, and it was like a slightly old school proposal going up to the board and getting a certain amount of funding signed off. Whereas in the deep dive interviews, it seemed that a lot more organisations simply consider this to be, because it's a regulatory requirement or such a core part of their business, it's not treated in that business case route. And finally, the desire for bespoke communication and documentation. This is something that we've passed over to the PMO team. I think a fair few organisations said they're not exactly sure when they need to dial into meetings or which parts of documentation are really key for their constituencies. So again, the PMO is going to do all they can to try and signpost which bits of documentation are key for which participants. And the final slide here, before I'll be quiet and let you ask some questions, is around SIT. So this was a very encouraging slide from the programme's perspective. So what we're looking for in SIT is A, lots of participants who were keen to take part in it, and B, a good spread across all of the different constituencies. And as you can see there, the first criteria is met. So we've got 52% of RA2 responders saying that they're keen to participate in SIT, either with mostly agree, or strongly agree to that question. And the graph on the left-hand side is showing that there's a really good split across all the different constituencies there. So every constituency has at least one participant that's keen to take part in SIT, and then obviously going up to a maximum of 8 or 9 for software providers, independent agents, and the I&C suppliers. So that's a very much a good news story for the programme as it moves forward into DBT. And with that, I'll press pause and say, are there any questions from anyone?
Hello, thank you, Pete and Chris, for the presentation. That was very informative. A big thank you to all the participants for submitting responses. I can see we've got a question from Steve quickly, so I'll let Pete, you take that first of all before I head on to Slido.
I was in the chat.
No, I've just got my hand up.
Okay.
Hi, it's so Steve Michon from UK Power Networks. I guess it's just a bit of an observation. I think on this question there, certainly more than on the first one, a number of the questions were almost had two parts to it. So, for example, I'm looking at one that was used as a criteria of readiness. It says, if you are using a service provider for your system changes, when do you expect to have completed signing contracts? But then it went on to say, if you're not using one or it's already done, something along those lines, leave it blank. So we left it blank, and the sort of feedback on this summary was didn't provide evidence, so you're not ready for, or you hadn't met the criteria. So I think, and there was a couple like that where the wording was maybe a little ambiguous, or because of the way it was worded with an either or, depending on the company's individual situation, there could have been legitimate reasons to leave it blank because it might have already been done, or we weren't intending to use that route, yet it was marked as not providing evidence. And that could be a reason why maybe some parties are being shown as only providing 3 out of 5 or 2 out of 5 pieces of evidence.
Yeah, fair point. We'll certainly look at it. One thing we've discussed is potentially getting slightly more bespoke surveys where we can. So where, for example, we know a participant might be going through SIT or might be using a software provider, whatever it might be, we could provide them with a survey that only asks those questions and therefore omits anything they don't need to answer. I think because we're such an early stage of the programme, we're still not exactly sure which participant fits into which camp. But yeah, completely take your point. Happy to review the questions again and pick that up in RE3.
Okay, and well, first of all, you can't necessarily put questions in Slido unless you're going to keep it to less than 100 letters. I don't think so. That doesn't seem to be an option when I was trying to do that.
Okay, we'll take a look. Sorry.
And the other point was one of the questions also was relating to about having completed an impact assessment. Yet the timing of when the survey went out, the impact assessment, I don't think was due until the 1st of November or something. And again, it was saying if you haven't done it yet, when will you have it done by? And we put a date that was end of October, so we would still have it done by the start of the DBT phase. But again, because we didn't actually have one at the time of the survey, despite it not being required at the time of the survey, it was marked as not having evidence, and therefore was another criteria that we were shown as not being ready for.
Yeah, I completely agree with that point. Actually, it's something that we noticed. We realised that we might have slightly jumped the gun on the impact assessment being included in part of CR9. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. It was definitely something we had to deal with when we were doing the survey results.
Yeah,
but yeah, I completely take your point. That was probably our miss.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hello, I am going to start reading off some of the questions for Chris and Pete to read through. So first of all, we've got Kerry has asked, as the POAP, and I'd need to check which POAP from Replan 2 Kerry is referring to, the impact assessment, plan and procure phase starts on 1st of November with DBT showing to start in February. Please can you provide some clarity on this? I assume that this is due to the different timelines set out in Replan round 2.
Yes, this was what I was alluding to earlier, and I think it was Kerry that brought this to our attention. Is a very good point in that the plan in Replan consultation round 2 has the planning, procurement and impact assessment starting on the 1st of November, and then technical design begins in Q1 2023. So yeah, that was, we're more than happy to factor that into the plans that we reviewed, and in a way that was one of the positives to come out of it, in the sense of we realised that a lot of organisations were ready to start technical design in early November. And so therefore, in a way, we're ahead of where we expected participants to be in the Replan round 2.
Can I just add to that, if that's okay? And which is great, that's been recognised that design building test doesn't actually start till to February. But when we got the feedback, it reverts back to Replan round 3 consultation will take place in December, January, and at that point we're looking for our plans. But if the planning phase doesn't actually end until the end of January, surely they shouldn't be looking for anyone's plans until at least February.
So I believe the end of January is the anticipated deadline for Replan round 3, so that would fit relatively neatly, I think.
Okay, so you won't be asking for people's plans until at least February then, I take it. Is that right? I just want to be sure, just want to make sure we're aligned, because it is becoming a bit confusing that if we've got a planning phase, it ends at the end of January, then plans then won't be ready until February, I would assume, because we would need to get them signed off and things like that internally, because at this phase we would be looking to understand whether we want to kind of go outsource or procure a piece of development and also kind of do that development in-house, whether we want to take part in SIT or not. So there's all these things that we're looking to, and then we need to kind of plan around that, and we'll be doing that by the end of January. But then you mentioned earlier on in the slides about there's a deadline of January, I think, for plans to, if we wanted to take part in SIT also. So I'm starting to get a bit confused about what these deadlines are, what these timelines are, and what we need to do by when, because it doesn't seem to be very clear.
I'd say the key date you need to keep in mind is end of January is when the Replan round 3 plans will be requested. So if you only take one thing away, that's the date you can hang your hat on.
Okay, so if we wanted to take part in SIT and we've not got a plan ready by middle of January, say, then that's not going to stop us taking part in SIT.
That'll be fine, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I clarify that? So we're looking for people to take part in SIT, but it's not a closing door situation. So if people start moving and they think they're ready for SIT, but they don't know at the time that they're ready for SIT, then the door will remain open. And if they're ready for SIT when SIT starts, then they can participate.
Great.
Does that help?
It does. I just want to make sure everyone's aligned, though, because the communication and the plans don't seem to be aligning. And when we got the assessment through, the questions on the assessment didn't align to impact assessment, planning and procurement. It aligned to design, build and test. And it was at that point when we had the conversation with you guys that it became apparent that there was a bit of misalignment there, and it was a bit unclear, which I think has been recognised now. It's just maybe going forward, if we could just be absolutely clear, because I am still starting to get confused, and if I'm getting confused, probably other people are too. It's just to make sure that one, I don't want to miss any kind of key dates or key deadlines, and yeah, we are quite keen to maybe take part in SIT. So to do that, like, when do we need to have things ready? And if we start missing things or we're not aligned and start falling behind, I just want to make sure that we're doing the right thing, and yeah.
Okay, we'll take that on board, Kerry.
Thank you.
Okay, Alice, do you want to go through the Slido questions?
Yes, sure. Okay, so next question is the market share being shown in these slides being measured by the number of MPANs or by the volume of electricity being settled?
That's the number of MPANs. So we tried to get volume data as well, so we could portray that alongside it, but essentially it wasn't something we were able to find. So we're using MPAN data specifically to use supply market share.
Great, thank you very much, Pete. And the next question is, when can we expect RA3? Will this be Q1 or Q2 of 2023?
So we don't have a hard and fast date for it yet, but I would expect it to be in Q2 next year, but I wouldn't say that's a hard and fast decision as of yet.
Okay. Next question is, do the results of RA2 show enough coverage for a successful SIP phase without the need for mandating participation?
I'll take that one. So hopefully, obviously central parties will need to be there for SIT, as will some software providers, but we're hoping we shouldn't have to mandate anybody from any suppliers into it. We're looking for volunteers, and we believe we're going to get enough volunteers, and the information we got back from RA2 seems to suggest that is quite a reasonable assumption.
Great, thank you, Chris. Next question is, are the parties applying/bidding to build the DIP subject to their own readiness? And if so, have they demonstrated it?
We are in the process of appointing the DIP provider. Part of their contract will be, as part of the procurement process, we have been assessing all of the bidders to make sure that they can meet the requirements to deliver on time.
Great, thank you. Next question, has the Migration PPR changed any of the MHHSPP Seeds takeaways following RA2?
That is still under review, so I can't answer that one at the moment.
I can say that we've started to reach out to a few organisations who indicated they might be in a position to finish their PIT early and thereby potentially take part in SIT as a group of early adopters. But that's, again, so we're having to refine at the moment and get back in touch with those organisations.
Great, thank you. Next is, we have a popular question about the escalation process. So perhaps one for you, Chris, regarding non-compliant parties and what will be the repercussions of this. Okay,
so obviously there's an obligation on all parties, all licensed parties. Clearly we cannot enforce participation against people like software providers because they're not licensed, they're free agents in that respect. But we were certainly looking at non-compliant by licensed parties, and we're currently looking at what we're doing. We're talking to the IPA about it, and if necessary, then it will be escalated to Ofgem.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is, when are you going to ask participants if they're going to operate any of the new roles? The report referred to responses from the existing roles.
I haven't been in discussions for any plans to ask about those imminently. Don't know if you have, Chris.
It's probably something we need to look at. I think that is a good question, and I think we need to take that back away and think about that one.
Okay. And another question, does Ofgem expect the programme to flex to accommodate current and expected market conditions in terms of obligations for suppliers?
You'll have to ask Ofgem that one. We've not been instructed to do so, shall we put it that way? Okay.
And then I'll also ask, the response rate is low given that we understood it was an obligation to respond to these requests. Is there a specific type of party that is not responding?
Well, it was noticeable that there was a difference between the different constituencies. So I'd say in speaking in very general terms now, it's smaller organisations that haven't been replying to this readiness assessment and readiness assessment number one. And I think the most noticeable divergence within any given constituency was within agents. So I think where we have DA organisations, they've been pretty good at responding and have made good progress with the programme as well. It tends to be the meter operators, the MOPs, that we're not getting such good engagement from. But again, I don't want to speak with a total blanket because obviously there are exceptions.
But it is worth pointing out that meter operators are not hugely affected by market-wide, so they don't cause an issue, but equally they need to be consulted and kept informed of what the programme's doing.
Great, thank you very much. And then I'll just do one more before I have to close up. What level of detail is expected from a supplier's plan?
So a very good question. For replan round 3, those criteria are still being put in place. So it's up for the programme to be decided in that with the IPA, and that will be clearly stated before the request for those delivery plans goes out in replan consultation round 3. But yeah, very good point, and it's definitely something we're already aware of, that we need to be crystal clear about what we're expecting in those requests. I think we can say with some confidence that those plans, or rather the criteria for those plans, will be simplified and made a bit easier to understand than they were in Readiness Assessment 2. But again, I don't want to commit to exactly what those criteria are going to be, because it's a fair few different bodies have to have their say on what that should be.
Great, thank you very much. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to go through all the questions on Slido, but we've taken note of any that came through, and they'll be answered on the clock that comes out next Wednesday. And I just wanted to say, as a closing sentence, thank you for your time today. As always, there's many different ways to get in touch with the PPC team. We're always here for meetings and questions, as well as any further support. As you can see from the slide in front, there is substantial work going on with the design work-off plan, as well as there's 2 subgroups held each week to discuss these work-off plan items. And there's a reminder that for Thursday, there's a DIP simulator webinar. If you would like to join, please email the PPC team and we can forward you the event. And we recommend your developers and test leads join this webinar. But just want to say thank you again for today, and thank you, Pete and Chris, for presenting.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye now.